Let's get started. I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully this is going to work. I have put all of the Makorot into this PowerPoint. Additionally, the shul did send the Makorot out earlier today. So, if you want, you can follow along from the PDF the shul sent out, but I also have all of it here. What I want to talk about this evening is the color of Techelet, what our Makorot tell us, and what science tells us about it. And I'm going to ask that, at least for the start of this shiur, that you suspend any knowledge that you already have as to what the color of Techelet is. And we will come back to, defining what color it is and how we define color. So to start that off, I'm going to give you this image that's on the right of the screen. This is a picture of a talus that my brother-in-law took for me while he was giving a tour of the old city of Jerusalem a few years ago. He knew I was interested in Techelet and some of the science behind it, and he saw this talus sitting, I believe it was in the Arab Shuk in Yerushalayim. And I think we would all agree, based on the knowledge we had before we just suspended that knowledge, is that this is not the color of Techelet. Might be a very pretty garment, but it is not Techelet. So the question we're going to go about asking is, what is that color? To give you a little bit of the motivation behind this, why am I interested in this? So I came across this pamphlet put out by the organization Untitled Chapter. They put this out a few years ago as part of the Daf Yomi cycle, based on the fourth parak of Menachos, which, as we will see shortly, where there is quite a bit of discussion about Techelet. But one thing really stuck out to me in this pamphlet. In the pamphlet, they summarized and cited an article from an academic journal from 1991, which characterized ancient blue dyes, including Techelet. And the key point from the article, and what Untitled Techelet picked up on, is that the Techelet obtained from the Murex trunculus snail derives its color from a sharp peak in its spectrum at exactly 613 nanometers. Unfortunately, because I have my slides up, I can't see your reactions to this, but I found this quite remarkable and interesting. Perhaps you would even say unbelievable. And as a scientist, that is what I found this to be. I found this to be quite unbelievable. I found it to be perhaps coincidental, but it also, as a scientist, was something that I felt like I could go about testing to understand what the color is of Techelet. And so as I move through this, we will have a discussion of what that 613 nanometers means, how it relates to color, and whether or not that 613 nanometers is an inherent quality of Techelet, which certainly could add another dimension to the mitzvah of Techelet, or if it is perhaps coincidental. So we'll come back to that. But let's start by first trying to figure out what we know from the various Makorot as to the color of Techelet. And to do that, we should really start with the appearances of Techelet. So Techelet first shows up in Parshas Truma. That's the first time we see the word throughout our history. It's the very beginning of Parshas Truma. Vaydaber Hashem and Moshe lemor, daber b'nei Yisrael v'yichlu li Truma. Yikol ish asher yidvenu libo tichlu et Trumati. So you should take the Truma, these gifts, and bring it to me. And what are these gifts? Zot ha-truma asher tichlu meitam, zahav v'chesef v'nechoshet. So you have some precious metals. Techelet v'argaman v'toat shani v'sheish v'izim. And then you have some fine fabrics that are dyed that we know as Techelet, argaman v'toat shani v'sheish v'izim. So far, we know that Techelet is just that, is Techelet. We don't actually have a definition of what Techelet is other than the word Techelet. We also see it in Mishnah, very famous Mishnah near the beginning of Brachot, where we have a discussion as when you can recite Shema in the morning. And one opinion is Shiakir bein Techelet lalavan, when you can distinguish between Techelet and white. And then a more stringent opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says bein Techelet lakarti, between Techelet and a leek. So that more stringent opinion might lead us to think that it is similar to a leek. We also then have the Mishnah in Menachot, the Techelet ena me'akevet et halavan, v'halavan ena me'akevet et techelet. So that the two do not infringe upon each other, their colors. But again, we only see the word Techelet without any definition of what Techelet is. There is one other important appearance of Techelet that I should point out right now, though it's not on the source sheet. It's something we all say 3 times a day, and that is in the 3rd paragraph of Shema, where we have Techelet on our tzitzit. Of course, as we come to Shavuot with the giving of the Torah, tzitzit are there to remind us of the 613 commandments, and Techelet is an essential part of that mitzvah. So far with these initial appearances, we don't have any definition as to color, as perhaps that you can distinguish it in a strict sense from a leek. So let's start with some arguments for the fact. I'm going to argue momentarily that Techelet is green. So where do we come up with that? Well, if we start with the Rashi on the Shemot, Parshas Truma that we just read, Rashi says, Tzemer tzavur b'dam chilazon v'tzava'o yarok. And so he says that the color of Techelet is yarok, green. In case we weren't sure what he was saying, he repeats himself in Bamidbar, where he said, Seva yarok shel chilazon, that it's the green color of the chilazon, which is the snail that Techelet comes from. In case we weren't sure what Rashi means by yarok, even though I think it's fairly clear, the Melechet Shlomo actually translates yarok for us. And I've bolded it down here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. Maybe I will set it so that I have a laser pointer on so you can see. He uses the word verdi, so he actually translates Rashi using the French verdi, which is green. Should point out he himself goes on to reject this opinion of Rashi, but he makes it very clear that Rashi means green as we know it today. And the Bartanura commenting on that Mishnah, bein Techelet lakarti, between Techelet and a leek, Seva ha-Techelet karov l'gavon shel karti, that the color of the Techelet is similar to the color of the leek. So perhaps Techelet is green, and everything we see in Shul is incorrect. Green isn't the only color that comes up. There's an argument actually for black. So this is the Ibn Ezra, again, on the same Parshas Truma. He says, Kimut Shacharot, that it's similar to black. However, he then continues, Hu Techelet kol hatzva'im. The Techelet is all of the colors. So he actually goes on, while he says black, what he describes might be better understood as brown. So again, you have an argument here for a color that is a brownish or blackish color. I didn't find any other appearances of this opinion, but I thought it was interesting to point out that there really doesn't seem to be understanding as to what color Techelet is, at least based on the understanding that we have here in the 21st century. There are, however, some opinions for blue, and I apologize that this is not showing up quite right. Let me just shrink. I will shrink this image really quick, and then you'll be able to see it. Okay, so the first argument for blue is that the Gemara Menachot makes it very clear that Techelet is very similar in color, in fact, indistinguishable from a plant-derived dye known as the kala ilan. And we know that the kala ilan is a plant known as indigo, from which indigo dye is derived. And we know that indigo dye is blue. So that is the first argument for blue. The word blue isn't used. Actually, it's interesting. The word blue, kahol, doesn't show up anywhere in all of Tanakh. I have not checked whether it shows up anywhere in the Gemara. That would be an interesting thing to look into. But it certainly does not show up in Tanakh anywhere, the word kahol, meaning blue. So we have two examples from the Gemara. They're relatively near each other. But basically they talk about the fact that this kala ilan dye could be used to create fake techelet or could be used to confuse techelet. I should also just say as I go through this, if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me. I don't have the chat box open on this, but if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt. All right, so another Gemara in Menachos talks about the Techelet, and it actually starts to talk about the color of Techelet, again, not by using the word kahol, but by likening the Techelet to other things for which we perhaps do know the color. So this Gemara here says, so the Techelet is similar to the sea. V'yam dolo l'rakia, and the sea is similar in color to the heavens. L'rakia l'kisei hakavod, and the heavens are similar to the kisei hakavod, to the heavenly throne. Shana Amar, and then bring some psukim as proof text. I give you the actual psukim down here. V'yaru et Elokim Yisrael v'tachar ragulav k'maaseh levant hasapir k'adsem hashamayim latohar. So it talks about this heavenly throne and the streets of the heavenly throne being lined with the sapir, a sapphire stone. So again, if we know sapphire stones, if our tradition hasn't changed in terms of what a sapphire stone is, we know that to be a blue color. Finally, we get to see the word blue itself, kahol, and that is in the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah. This was the first instance I could find of the word blue actually being used. I don't have to read through all this on the inside, but here I have it bolded for you, the word blue. So one other argument for blue, again from the Gemara Menachot, says that the fish itself, or what we know today as the chilazon, the snail, is similar in color to the sea, and therefore its color that it dyes is similar to that. I should also point out, I think it's been very interesting that we have different sources saying different colors. Modern commentaries really struggle with how to translate the word techelet. The consensus is that it is a shade of blue, but the word that is used really differs depending on which source you're looking at, even within the same publishing houses. So if you open up an ArtScroll Tanakh, the word Techelet itself is translated in the English to be turquoise. If you look at the Steinsaltz translation, you see sky blue and purple blue for the same word, whether you're looking at Gemara and Menachos or the Mishnah and Brachot. You see different translations of the word. What I thought was very interesting was that the ArtScroll translation of the Rashi in Shemot adds a parenthetical C-S-E-A in front of the word green, even though Rashi clearly isn't saying that. But later on, when Rashi uses the same word yarok in Bamidbar, they translated the greenish dye of the chilazon. So everyone seems to agree that it's a blue color, but they struggle with how to handle, in their translations, these sources that very clearly are not about blue, or not saying blue. So my question for you then is, what color is Techelet? And really, are all these colors that are up on the screen now the same? Right? We have a Mishnah that likens it to the color of a leek. So here's some leeks for you. We learn that it is similar to the sea. And so here's the sea. This is the sea near Haifa, which is around near where the chilazon was farmed. But the sea is likened to the heavens, which is this color here, which is likened to a sapphire, and you can depend which opinion you want on a sapphire, whether it's the modern gemstone or the older type rock color. But I would say, suffice it to say, I would argue that none of the colors among these 6 images on here are exactly the same. So what color is Techelet? We could take this one step further. Having seen all the different translations for color, I decided to go to the color experts. And here are all the different shades of blue that are put out by Crayola. And I've identified many of the different colors that are used in translation for Techelet or commentaries on Techelet. Things like standard blue, blue-green, blue sky, there's a blue-violet. Here's indigo itself, a turquoise blue, a sky blue. It's going to be similar to the sea. Here's aquamarine. I like to point out that there's a sky blue and a blue sky, and they are different colors. So again, it comes back to, well, what color is Techelet? So one hypothesis as to why the Torah is not specific about the color is the fact that the word blue, or more generally words for colors, are relatively new to the lexicon of languages. This is true of Hebrew and many, many other ancient languages. And this is an excerpt from an article that Gilad sent to me and kindly translated as well. The original article is in Hebrew. But without going through the entire thing, basically, there were very few words for colors. So the idea of the 96 color box of crayons was entirely foreign to ancient people. They had a few colors that they needed to describe what they needed, and that was about it. So as a result, we don't have the description of Techelet as blue because the word blue simply did not exist, or was not important enough to differentiate between blue and, say, green, that those were essentially, from a descriptive perspective, the same color during the times of the Gemara, or perhaps even Rashi. Another potential hypothesis as to why the Torah is not specific is that all these commentaries were written by men. And it is well known from biology that men are not as good at seeing colors as females. Colorblindness is much more prevalent in men. It's genetically passed as an X-linked trait, which means it is more often found in men. And so I cite here an article from National Geographic News that females are better at discriminating among colors, and men are better at fast-moving objects and discerning detail from a distance. And this is thought to be evolutionarily driven. Men are also not good at distinguishing among shades in the center of the color spectrum, specifically blues, greens, and yellows. So perhaps this is why we don't have good descriptions for the color of Techelet, and we can't differentiate between all those different colors that were used that are not quite the same. So let's talk for a moment about color and what color is. So I'm going to take all of you back to kindergarten, where we learned about the color wheel. And with the color wheel, what you didn't learn in kindergarten probably was about the electromagnetic spectrum, and specifically within that, the visible spectrum. So all light comes in different wavelengths that are part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and the light we can see varies in wavelength from about 400 nanometers to about 700 nanometers. And those correspond to different colors. Now, the color that we see is actually the opposite of the color that is absorbed by the object that we're looking at. So, for example, here's a pink cup that belongs to my children. The color we see is pink, which is, we'll say, is red from the color wheel, plus some white mixed in. But so that red you'll see shows up around 700. So what we're actually seeing is the reflection of 700 nanometer light and the absorbance of the color that is opposite. So if it were red, the opposite would be green. So to understand how a molecule or a color is absorbed and what color you would then see, you simply have to look across the color wheel to figure it out. So what I went and did is I found a website that actually allows you to put in different wavelengths, and it will show you the color that is absorbed by that wavelength. And from that, we could then infer from looking at a color wheel what color we would see. So I don't know how well it's coming out, but I've shown here colors 620 nanometers, 630 nanometers, which is what the Techelet was reported to absorb at, 603 nanometers, and 591 nanometers. And if you look at the differentiation between these colors, we move in the color wheel from the absorbance perspective from around here in the yellow up around to the orange and perhaps even into what is labeled here as vermilion. So if we then look across that color wheel, we would see that we get anything from purple around through to teal. Don't quite make it to green, but perhaps to teal. The teal would be what you see if you have a 620 nanometer absorbance, and the purple is what you see if you see a 591 nanometer absorbance. I put the 591 in there because there's literature reports on argamon having peak absorbances around 591 nanometers, argamon being a purple color. So what I next did is I actually went back and took a look at that original paper that was published in 1991 and cited in the Techelet pamphlet. And what they actually did was they took a garment that had been dyed with Techelet and extracted the dye from that garment and then separated it using a technique called liquid chromatography. And then for each of the chemical components that they separated out, they then looked at the UV absorbance of that spectrum of the chemicals. So you can see from this is the separation. You see 3 different peaks here. This is just the initial, don't worry about that. There are 3 different peaks here, and each one has a different absorbance. So the first one here, this is a molecule called indigo dye. This is what is derived from the plant indigo, but this is also one of the chemicals that was found from the Murex trunculus snail. Indigo dye, and they found it had a peak absorbance of 613 nanometers. However, the garment did have 2 other dyes in it. You'll notice they look very similar to the indigo, the difference being these bromines on either side. So this molecule here has 2 bromines, this one here has only 1 bromine. And as you add more bromine to it, you end up with a shift in the peak from 613 to 600 nanometers. That means that the color would be getting more purple as you observe it. Now this is very important scientifically. This is a way today that we can distinguish between Techelet, that is actually Techelet derived from the Murex trunculus, from the Gila zone, as opposed to the indigo derived, the plant indigo derived dye. That which comes from the snail will have at least trace amounts of these 2 chemicals, whereas the plant derived will have only this chemical in it. So there are ways now that we can test to see the difference. Now, of course, if you have a blend of these 3, the color might change depending on the ratio of these 3. So what color is Techelet supposed to be? I took this one step further and I actually purchased the indigo dye. So just this molecule here as the purified form. And I brought it into my own lab at DuPont down in Wilmington. And what I want you to see from this, it's hard to tell, partly because the scale is different of the jars, and partly because one is so much lighter than the other due to differences in solubility of the dye. But if you look very closely, the color, and I'm not talking about the brightness, but the absolute color of these 2 jars is different. These are the same 2 solutions over here, just in the same size jar. I put in a bigger jar so you'd have more light to penetrate and you'd see more color. But the 2 shades are different. This one is a little bit more purple than this one. These are the same chemical. This is the indigo dye, that was characterized as having a peak of 613 nanometers. Two different colors, which would mean two different UV absorbances. And I actually went and measured that myself. I measured the UV absorbance. What I actually did is I measured the UV absorbance of the indigo dye as a function of the solution that it was in. So either acetone, which is nail polish remover, or acetone with certain amounts of water until you're into a pure water system. Going back to this image, this one here, this jar is acetone, and this one is pure water. So these are the UV absorption spectra that I got using an instrument in my lab. Makes it easier to see. I've now just normalized the peak, so it's all at the same height. And you can see the shift in the peak from about 600 nanometers out to all the way out, almost approaching 700 nanometers. So this shows a massive shift in the color of the indigo dye, color of the Techelet, presumably. And similarly means that it's not necessarily 613 nanometers. In fact, I can plot these peaks. So this is the peak as a function of the amount of water in there. And I found that the pure acetone solution had a peak absorption of 600 nanometers, but a very nice linear regression as you add more and more water into the system. So if I wanted the peak absorbance to be 613 nanometers, I could do that. You just look across the graph from about this point here. You know, that would hit around here. So around 37% water or so, you would have 613 nanometers. So coming back to my initial question, was this a coincidence or an inherent property? You know, a deeper meaning into the mitzvah of Techelet? The answer is somewhere in between. Absolutely, the Techelet can have a peak absorption of 613 nanometers. If you look around Shul, and this is something I have done, and look at different Talaisim that have Techelet on them, you will notice that they are not all the same color. They are different gradations and shading. What I also thought was really interesting, though, I found, and literature supports it, that the indigo dye, the major component of Techelet, has a peak absorption of 600 nanometers. So while the 613 was very interesting, 600 is the gematria of tzitzit itself. So I thought that was very interesting, and perhaps gives some deeper meaning to the tzitzit. I don't have an answer to the color bound. How far to the purple or how far towards the green can you go and still be kosher Techelet? I think it's a very interesting question, but one that I don't have a good answer for or any answer for at this point, to understand, from an upper and lower limit, what is acceptable for it still to be considered Techelet. Especially because the Techelet is synthesized from argamon. It's the same starting material. It's just how far you move from argamon to Techelet. A definition of what the boundary point is, I didn't seem to be able to find, but maybe perhaps food for thought. So I believe that is it. These are just some pictures of the actual dyeing of wool that I did as well, where you can again see differences in color. This is now whether or not it was exposed to light. That's how you convert from the argamon to the Techelet. But with that, I'm going to stop at this point and see what people's thoughts are, comments, questions, and open it up for a conversation. So you can either unmute yourself to ask questions, or you can put something into the chat and I will see it there. Any questions? Well, if not, I thank you for your attention. I hope you found this informative. I hope it gave a new, different or added meaning to the mitzvah of Techelet, especially for those of you who wear Techelet. I started wearing Techelet after going through and learning more about it, doing this science. It really gave it another deeper meaning to me. And hopefully something to think about as we get ready to receive the Torah tomorrow evening, Chag HaShavuot. So thank you all, Chag Sameach, and have a good evening.
You too. Good job, Josh.